Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Michael. Michael, for everyone out there listening, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Michael Graziano. I'm a professor of neuroscience and psychology at Princeton University. And these days, I study the brain basis of consciousness.
Okay, brain basis of consciousness. What is consciousness? Because see, I've been getting into the realm of AI, and it's kind of consciousness is kind of, I can't even explain it. I can understand many aspects of it. And then an AI is basically consciousness in its own. It's kind of evolving, or maybe it's not. I don't know. What do you think?
Right. So obviously, lots of different people have different notions of what that word means, what it refers to. And so that's the first hurdle is what do different people mean by that word? And the most common definition among people in the general public, but also among scientists and philosophers, the most common definition centers around experience, subjective experience. And so what I mean by that is some people think of consciousness as the thoughts in your head, the perceptions coming in, the memories that you're recalling. But in a sense, really, those are just the things, the items that we can be conscious of. But the consciousness itself is the subjective experience of those things. So just to be even more clear, you talked about computers and artificial intelligence. We know how to make computers that take in sensory information, that make decisions, that store and recall memories. We know how to give computers the content, but nobody yet has figured out how to build a computer that has a subjective experience of those things. So that's the key, that's the essential property that people call consciousness.
What about, okay, so this brings me down a weird kind of thought pattern, which is like animals, for instance. Some people, we believe animals have a sense of consciousness in a sense. They have dreams and stuff. So I guess that really depends on what category you put that in. But I remember a long time ago, I studied a thing called plant perception. And I don't know if it boils down the line of intelligence and what we think is intellectual. Like dolphins, for instance, can communicate to each other and they have different accents. We consider them an intelligent being. But plants, for instance, maybe they don't have a sense of thought that we know of or can perceive, but to say that they're not intelligent or to say that they don't have a level of consciousness. Even people would say plants don't have consciousness. Plants are just these things. I'm like, well, no, because a pencil is a thing. A plant is something different. A plant is life. We categorize that as life, so it would have a sense of consciousness. And then it really dives down the rabbit hole of where people study metaphysics or try and understand what metaphysics is to dive down the consciousness further. And then my next question would be, is that safe? Because I feel like when you start to contemplate who you are, what you are in today's time and age, where we are, a lot of people, myself included, I'm going through an existential crisis, trying to figure out who and what I am. Do I have a purpose, and what is that purpose, and how do I find that purpose? How do I achieve that purpose? I'm okay, by the way. I'm not depressed. I'm just saying, when you start thinking deeper into that realm of state, you start questioning and you can kind of freak yourself out. Like I'll give myself a panic attack sometimes trying to go deep down into a situation. But if I think and like I said, it's where my mind's going. If I think the atoms in my hand are kind of like the atoms in this table, but I can't phase my hand through the table and it stops when it hits that table. I can think so much into it where you start thinking you got superpowers or you got some type of capabilities that aren't physically possible. Now, I might just be rambling here, but I start wondering, is it safe to keep diving into the consciousness like a lot of people try and do? Science does. We keep trying to split things deeper and deeper and deeper, which is important for classifying and detailing. But how far does that go to where you start to unravel yourself and unravel your mind in a sense?
Right. So I would come that's a lot. It's a lot of really interesting stuff. I would come back again. Uh, so one can think of consciousness as everything. Like it starts to grow and it encompasses everything. And it encompasses after a while, if you have a very permissive definition of it, it starts to take over how you feel and who you are as a person, and all of life and all of what you're thinking and what you hope to do. And then you start thinking, well, therefore, if it's everything, then plants must have it too, and all animals have it. And there are people who are what they call pan psychists, who think that everything in the universe has consciousness, pencils and toenails and potatoes and galaxies. And when you expand it out like that, then this word loses all meaning because it encompasses everything. So one might as well just say everything. So the and those are all still really interesting interconnected questions. But the scholarship on consciousness, like the science, the philosophy, has really, really focused the question down onto what things have, as I said before, what things have a subjective experience of what it is like, what it feels like, subjective experience. And how does that come about? What does that mean? And so when you put it that way, uh, the things you're talking about, like who you are and what your purpose in life is, and what your body's made out of, and so on, these are um, things that you can be conscious of, but they're not really consciousness itself. It's almost like if you walk around a room and you see it's cluttered with a huge number of objects, and someone's taken red paint and painted over some of the objects. The red paint is like the consciousness part. It's on some items and not other items. But the items themselves are not the consciousness part. And so plants probably aren't conscious as far as we know. They lack that kind of component. They do process information. Plants have, if you will, a kind of intelligence. Lots of creatures like insects have enormous amount of intelligence, but nobody knows if they have a subjective experience. That's really hard to assess. Most animals, most mammals probably have the same thing that we have, the same subjective experience that we have. And in people, you can be conscious of these really deep thoughts that you just talked about, but you can also be conscious of really simple things, like just looking at something and saying, oh, that the grass is green. I have a subjective experience of green. There's green feels like something to look at. That's a very simple thing. It's not a really deep, personal, complicated set of concepts. It's just green, but you can have a subjective experience of it. Or you could have a subjective experience of really deep philosophical questions about yourself. So consciousness is just the experienceness of anything at all, whatever it is, simple or complex. And the question for the neuroscientist is why is so much in the brain not conscious and a tiny bit is? And what's the difference? What makes that tiny bit conscious? What is the consciousness part itself? And so that most of the research and the scholarship is really focused in on this tiny little question, which is, you mentioned AI earlier. It's relevant to AI because then people start asking, well, if we can understand it, can we build it? That's a really interesting question. That's what I would say, that many of the things you just raised are questions of the items of which you can be conscious, but not really questions about the consciousness part itself, if that makes sense.
Well, why are we so different? Isn't that the bigger question? Because then if you look at if we can replicate like our brain in an AI form or something, it probably wouldn't have that consciousness aspect to it. It might have like a knockoff, like a Walmart brand, but I don't think it would be 100% replicable. I think somehow what this species, the human race, has developed, or somehow, I don't know how, but it's just different. It's like a one off. You know what I mean? And I know a lot of people will be like, well, that's religion. And it's like, I don't necessarily want to put it in that category. I think it's something just we just haven't been able to explain. And I don't know if it's replicable. Obviously we can recreate, but I mean, that human aspect, what people would call being human, thoughts, emotions, all these other types of things, or just a realization of the things around you, awareness, I would say would be a better word for it. That's something completely different. And why is it just exceptional to us? I mean, the fact that me and you are able to have this conversation and realize we're in a conversation about a specific subject, that in its own is amazing, but I can't explain that.
So when you say, why are we so special? I would say, let's include in that a lot of other animals and not just people. Like other animals, your pet dogs, they don't have the concepts that we're bandying back and forth. Um, but they probably have that awareness that you're talking about. They probably look at the world and have an experience of much of what they look at, just like we do. They probably have emotions just like we do. I mean, the neural circuitry for emotions is more or less the same in a dog as it is in a person. So uh, it's not quite as special to us as it may seem. There's probably a lot of creatures out there. Some people say octopuses also, which is a really interesting side question, but that's really hard to study in an octopus. Uh, but yeah, so I think that there are really incredibly complicated, not yet well understood systems in the brain that are responsible for this. And can we ever get to the point where we can replicate them? That's something that's really interesting to a lot of people who are trying to study that. But right now, the thing we call consciousness, the subjective experience or feel part, is by most people's guess probably something present in a huge range of animals, maybe mammals and birds, maybe other animals as well, but probably in a fairly large range of animals and not just unique to people.
Does that the consciousness aspect specifically on humans though, does can that be impacted in a way? And d- eh, like I look at experience, for instance, we talked about
Mhm.
experience,
Yeah,
but like I always usually talk about environmental influences, how a person's
yeah.
thoughts can develop based on what scenarios they're placed in, such
Mhm.
as decision making, or choice in life, or moral decisions are kind of different. But do you think that would change generationally? We look at generations, for instance, being involved in technology. Does that affect your consciousness? I always talk about how people become more lazy with the social media device, and we
Yeah,
let a lot of technology do stuff for us. In a sense, that's good, but I look at the damage that does long term. Does that affect
yeah.
our growth? My example, after talking to so many people who study like Rome history and all these old ancient medieval history style things, is were there always people that were thinking at this level, or were these exceptional few? Did they go through something different? And some might say they go through something different. But if I told you right now, you're the smartest scientist in the world, you're all this, and I tell you that from when you're a child
Uh-huh.
to when you become an adult, does your consciousness or your thoughts change? Does it even, it might not even be true. It might not, I'm not saying you're not. I'm just saying that Plato, for instance, or whoever, if you pick one of these scholars and they were raised from birth knowing that they were way smarter than everyone else around them, does that cause them to grasp for more intellectual thoughts or intellectual ideas? And does that form that person then? Or is it just something else?
Absolutely. What you're taught about yourself changes who you are. And of course, what you end up studying and learning changes who you are. And any life experience radically changes who you are. Um, I the only thing I would say in caution is, if you take someone like Plato, who was this brilliant guy, and you take some totally average, or maybe even less than average, somebody who's not smart at all, somebody maybe who has um, a below average mental capacity, and you compare them, I don't think you really want to say that Plato is more conscious, or that he has consciousness and the other person doesn't. Like there's a level at which they both are conscious, have consciousness, and have a certain equality, right? They're conscious of different things, and Plato's world is intellectually a much broader world. Um, so you're talking about the internal life, the intellectual life, that can change enormously, of course. You're quite right about that. I mean, we can change our own lives right now. We go study some new topic, or we go have some new experiences. It'll change who we are for the rest of our lives. So,
Maybe I'm just
yes,
missing the mark on what consciousness is or the topic of discussion, but I just look at like if your thoughts are formed, I feel like your brain is going to be completely different in a sense. If you're like if I do a bunch of podcasts with a bunch of philosophy people or a bunch of people who study like just deep intellectual type discussions about things, and then I have a conspiracy one. I need that conspiracy person to balance me out from all the very serious inner deep discussions, because it'll start forming my mind and it'll affect my whole day.
yeah,
um
totally.
yeah,
I know what you mean.
yeah.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the world of thought inside of us is constantly changing, and inputs, conversations, and can change that, as well as our own thought. Like a person can sit down and think really hard and change themselves from that point on forever. I mean, there's lots of things that can change that world of thought in there. Yes.
So I'm just curious if that develops like from a young age. Is there like a developing point, or we just always kind of have it? Is this something about our brain? Because we all know our brains evolve. Like they say, your brain's not fully developed until you're like 24. But I start wondering what impacts really affect that developmental part. What is that? What does that change it to be? Am I the person that I'm supposed to be, or am I a person that might have had a bad experience that might have steered me on? I mean, we all have fears, obviously, but if that's just in our head, like people say ADHD, mental health issues, or something like that. I have ADHD. People say that's in your head. I'm like, no shit, that's
Yeah,
that's
of
the
course.
problem, yeah. But
Well,
that's the thing is like, is that just a way that I'm thinking about it, or a way that's been ingrained psychologically that I just can't fix, or is that something about my development that's always been a part of me?
right. Uh, I think, well, ADHD is really complicated, of course, as you would know. And there's lots of different, there's a huge range of symptoms that get stuffed into the category of ADHD. And so it gets really hard to talk about as one uniform thing. But there are some people who have this thing that have been labeled as ADHD, who have something more or less from birth. It's built into their brains in some way. The wiring is slightly different, and not necessarily bad or good. It's just different. And so that's something that would affect that person's development all the way through from beginning to end. Of course, there's other people who have different set of issues, or maybe no issues at all. There's people who are just normal people who are a little rambunctious that get labeled as ADHD. So that one's a little harder topic to talk about, just because of the diversity of different people in it. But if you have a condition, um, something, some alternate way that your brain is wired very early on, it will affect your development. It'll affect who you become as a person. It'll affect your perspective on life. Of course, all these things will shape who you are, and how you think.
Hmm. Because I start wondering, like for me being interested in so many things, what made you get interested in focusing on this? Like, is that something that you've always been obsessed with as a kid, or is this has just been something that recently developed? Like something impacted you or touched you in such a way that you were like, I want to study this specifically.
Well, I have studied this particular topic for about 10 years, a little more than 10 years now. So my work as a neuroscientist goes back much longer before that. And I've studied about three different things, roughly a decade for each topic that I've studied. So this is the latest one, and it's so fascinating. I think I'm probably going to stick with this for the rest of my work. I don't see an ending to this particular puzzle. Um, but what really got me into it, I studied really nuts and bolts issues in neuroscience. You know, how the brain controls movement and how it takes in sensory input. So really low level processes. And uh, uh, actually, this began when my son was born. He was about when he got to be about 3, and I started uh, making his stuffed animals talk. And so I started to learn ventriloquism, and it turns out the way to become a good ventriloquist is to have a 3-year-old who constantly demands that you practice it every single day with him. And so I gradually got good at that, and I began to notice this weird property of ventriloquism, that when you do it right, or you see people who do it right, you get this very spooky sense that the puppet has its own mind and its own consciousness and its own perspective. And so uh, it occurred to me that, first of all, we do this to each other. Like, technically, to you, I'm just pixels on a screen, but you see my mouth flap open and close, you hear the words come out, and you have this strong, hopefully strong sense that I'm a real person. And in a sense, I'm like a ventriloquist puppet to you. Um, and we do this to ourselves as well. We look at ourselves, and we are projecting mind into ourselves and into other people around us. And so there's some system in the brain that handles that, that allows us to perceive and project mind onto everything around us, whether it's a puppet or whether it's an actual person or a pet dog or whatever it is. And that was really the beginning of all this work, basically asking, how is it that people understand what consciousness is? How is it that people see it in themselves? How is it that people see it in each other? And so it all came out of making a bunch of stuffed animals talk. That was about 10 years ago. And that was the beginning of this particular line of research.
Do you think it's because they want to feel comfortable? Like, it might be a weird question the way I'm saying it, but when you try and develop things like making like stuffed animals feeling real, mostly because you're giving it a consciousness, or you're saying this thing is conscious and is aware, is able to have a discussion with me, and you talk to it. People say that could be imagination. Yeah, in a sense that could be imagination, but is it a sense of feeling comfortable as well too? Every kid has a stuffed animal, and every kid usually when they're scared grabs a stuffed animal or something. It's a sense of comfortability. Now, me and you talking, we both assume that we both have a sense of consciousness. We're both aware, we're both talking, we're both able to have a discourse, whatever you want to say, but it doesn't translate onto other things. I feel like it only goes into certain situations when it comes to an inanimate object, or I could talk to a pencil, it's not going to talk back. I mean, if it did, that'd be a little bit nuts. But it's just weird where the lines get drawn, because like even animals have a sense of consciousness, but we don't consider it at the same level as ours. Like, we treat it differently. Like, that's my dog. I can't have a sentence and speak. Like, people can talk to their dog, but they always use baby talk. Why does baby talk get pulled out? It's like it's a dumbed down version is how they view it.
Sure, I mean, dogs have much more limited capacity to think complex thoughts and to understand the long-term cause and effect in their world. So that's absolutely true. But there's another sense in which they are still conscious, and they presumably still have a just as vivid a sense of their current reality around them. So, um, but yeah, comfort. You asked the question about comfort. I find that really interesting. Um, I think that consciousness has two purposes for people, and one is private. I'm conscious, I have my own consciousness, I know about myself, and so on. And the other is social. And in people, at least, consciousness is intensively social. That is, I see consciousness in you and lots of other people around me constantly. And this is what ties our social world together, that I can look at other people and I can perceive in them a conscious human being, and therefore figure out how to react to them in a meaningful way. So consciousness is an intensively social endeavor for people. So I think it gives us all comfort in a way. I mean, we get more sophisticated as we get older, but even older people, for example, people treat their cars like conscious beings. You know, they get mad at their car when it breaks, or they get mad at the computer when it breaks. People are really prone to this. There's something in us that makes us really prone to attribute mind states to things, even if they don't have brains and don't actually have mind states. So there's something very natural in human beings to project this stuff onto the spaces and the objects around us.
This might be a stupid thought that I just had, but are we sensing electricity or current? Like, for instance, I bring the example of like death. When someone dies, you immediately know this person is no longer conscious. It's not the same when it's sleeping. There's still an electrical current when somebody's sleeping. You're dreaming. You're in a whole other altered state of consciousness, I would say. But when it comes to death, you can immediately stop projecting at this public consciousness. It's gone. There's nothing else there. That now becomes not really it sounds horrible saying an object, but in a sense, it's like an object. It's no longer consciousness. I think it brings to a bigger point of I always had this example of I don't think the soul is in your chest. I think it's in your head because you can take anything out of my heart transplant, whatever you want. But as soon as someone touches your brain, it can erase who you are. And if you consider your consciousness or your thoughts your identity, I mean, that's in your head. It's not really your organs, besides your brain.
I agree that it's in your brain. Um, and I agree that if you mess with someone's brain, that changes them. And, you know, there's uh, literally 2,500 years of history of people with various brain ailments and damage that radically changes who they are and how they react. Um, yeah, I doubt that we're sensing anything electric. Um, I think that we're just really good at seeing the visual cues that come from people. Um, and there are cases, and these are some of the hardest cases, that are at the edge, especially people who are in deep coma and brain dead, where one group of family looks at them and says, they're still with us. And the other group of people looks at them and says, they're gone. It's time to pull the plug. And the two sides are equally sure of themselves. And then, of course, there's a huge legal and moral battle, and nobody's quite clear what to do. And I don't know what's clear to do. I'm not making a recommendation in cases like that. I'm just making the point that there are cases where it's not at all clear. And, you know, you're not directly sensing something from the person. You're interpreting, essentially. Your brain is automatically interpreting what you see, what you hear, and people come up with really strikingly different assessments. But it's another good example of how people are so prone to project consciousness into the things around them. So we see a person, a living, breathing person, and we know that's a conscious being. And we see somebody that is no longer with us and passed on, and we know there's no consciousness in there, and it changes. It's like a switch flips, and it changes how we see and feel and experience that situation.
What do you think about the people that try and dive down deeper into what consciousness is? Like not necessarily studying like maybe the neuroscience or the more scientific angle, but try and do like lucid dreaming and all these other forms of what they would call metaphysics. It seems like that they're diving deeper into what the mind is.
Oh, I love the idea of lucid dreaming. Um, and there's actually a fair amount of science on lucid dreaming.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting topic. So, uh, yeah, dreaming itself is a really interesting topic. So that's a good example where definitions of consciousness conflict, right? Because you could say by one definition, you're not conscious, you're asleep. But by another definition, you're still having experiences. So you are conscious in that sense. You're having subjective experiences while you dream. And that would be the definition that I go with. Namely, you're having your consciousness is still there. You're having conscious experiences, even though you're dreaming. But dreaming tends to involve a loss of really high level cognitive control or understanding of what's going on around you, which is why really weird, irrational things happen and we tend not to notice. And what happens in lucid dreaming, it turns out, is the parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the highest level of cognitive control, begins to become more active, almost like a waking state active. And that allows you to understand your dream better and understand that you're in a dream and to start controlling the elements of the dream. And that's just a really fascinating state. This moment you realize I'm dreaming, this is not real, and I can change it at will. That's just such a really fascinating state. So, yeah.
Have you ever tried looking into the unconscious, like when people are unconscious? Like I always found that weird when I was a kid. You hear someone get knocked out in sports or something, like, oh, he was unconscious. It's like he just wasn't like, is that the same kind of thing as like a vegetable state, I would say. Like we immediately put that in a category. This person's no longer awake. Then we classify like, is it just your eyes? Is it just the fact that I can see that little retina in your thing? To like, if you close your eyes right now, I'd be like, he's not conscious. He's asleep or something. You know what I mean? We immediately start assuming, going through these categories in our head, that you're not focused in on being awake or being around. So does that mean we only assimilate consciousness with our eyes?
I think eyes are really important. It's one of the main ways that we figure out someone else is awake and aware and conscious. We have a special relationship to eyes. There's systems in the brain that evolved specifically to process and track other people's eyes. So eyes are really important, but they're not the whole thing. So when you're unconscious, or when someone hits you on the head and you're knocked out, there's different levels of unconscious. So medically, I forget what the exact number of levels are, but medically, there's a whole set of levels that are distinguished depending on how reactive you are. So someone in the deepest, most brain dead level of coma is totally non-responsive, and you can have gradations up from there. So just getting hit on the head and knocked out, you're probably not at the very bottom level, but you're probably well below the level of a dream. People in dreams are much more reactive and their brains are much more active. And then, of course, we have levels beyond that where you're just sort of a little bit sleepy, you're a little bit asleep, and then groggily coming out of sleep, and then normal everyday alertness. And there's probably levels where you're like super alert. So it's actually not a bi-valued thing. It's not like unconscious or conscious. It's a little more graded than that, as it turns out, which is really interesting.
So if we look at brain activity, for instance, now, like with some certain mental disorders like schizophrenia, there's just certain parts of the brain that might be firing off, or they'll use like when someone gives somebody a medication, it inhibits a certain part. I start wondering, like when it comes to just brain activity in general, are a lot of people like certain categories where a brain might be too active, might be beneficial, but at the same time might be negative as well, too.
So yeah, the relationship between brain activity in certain areas and certain networks and people's thoughts and behaviors, of course, that's super interesting and really at the heart of a lot of clinical medicine. And schizophrenia is a good example. I mean, there's networks or systems in the schizophrenic brain that are overactive, and you can give medications that tend to tamp down that activity and prevent these racing, scattered, disordered thoughts that often come with schizophrenia. Um, yeah, there's other areas of the brain though. So you often get a weird imbalance. So you can, some medications will help the schizophrenics, but at the same time, it will make them have a lot of difficulty coordinating their movement because you're suppressing by accident, or it's a side effect, but you're suppressing other parts of the brain that help control movement initiation. And so you can get schizophrenic people who have treatment that make them better on the schizophrenic side, but they end up with this very slow kind of shuffle and inability to move correctly, right? And then you have people on the opposite side who have Parkinson's disease and they have trouble moving, and you give them drugs to rev up those parts of the brain, but at the same time, you're also, as a side effect, revving up other parts of the brain. And some of these medications can make the Parkinson's patient develop schizophrenic symptoms. So the brain's really complicated. The
Yeah.
systems are really interrelated. And as you start messing around medically with pushing something down to help somebody, you're probably also pushing down something that you don't want to reduce. And all these symptoms sort of interrelate in really, really complicated ways.
Do you think, I mean, with as much as we know about our brains, we know very little in the grand aspect of what their full capabilities are. At least in my opinion, I would say, just because it seems like there's a lot of things that just are just there's probably a scientific explanation. I just haven't came across it, but there's a lot of things that just seem magical in a sense. Like, where does this come from, and where does that go? It's like the Big Bang. You say the Big Bang created everything, but then go deeper than that, and then go deeper than that, then go deeper than that. There's always going to be a what, but what about this? But what about this? But when it comes to, I feel like partially we are a little bit too disconnected from this thing that's inside of us, mostly because we now medication's good and all, but I feel like if we had a better grasp or better understanding of what it is and the capabilities of it, we can diagnose it better than rather than just handing it a pill. Because I mean, a pill works for some diseases, you need one. But I feel like if you understood it better, if you had a better connection to it, you might be able to find a more effective way of treating it rather than just giving it a type of medication.
Well, that I would agree with. That's a good pitch to funding for neuroscience research, because that's exactly the core idea, that this organ is so complicated. We know so little about it, and yet uh, so much can go wrong with it. And if you want to help people, and if you want to treat these, every kind of mental disability from one end to the other, uh, you've got to know more about that organ. And there's so much that's not that well known. I mean, there's a lot that is known, enormous amount that's known, but it tends to be at the kind of nuts and bolts level, simpler level. The really rich, complicated, subtle things tend not to be understood at all.
When it comes to limiting of like your research or your resources of being able to research deeper into this, is it just a lot of it technology based or is most of it just based on funding?
Um, the limits on the field right now are technology, and the technology is always improving. But for example, you can put someone in an MRI scanner and measure brain activity, and have them do all kinds of different things, or ask them questions, or whatever you do in the scanner, and measure what areas of the brain are becoming active. Uh, but there's a limit to how fine grained the measurements are. So spatially, you can get down to maybe a millimeter, which is pretty good. But individual neurons are a lot smaller than a millimeter.
Yeah.
Like millions of them fit in one cubic millimeter. Uh, and the time scale is really poor. That is, you can measure in an MRI down to about half a second. And a whole world of stuff goes on in half a second. And so as technology improves, that's the kind of thing that I think will push the field forward. How to get the enormous amount of data that you need out of you know an active brain, non-invasively, hopefully, put someone in some
Yeah.
kind of futuristic scanner and be able to measure what's going on in there at such resolution, spatial and time resolution, that you can begin to really unravel the algorithms and the details and understand what's connected to what at a functional level. That's technology. Technology's just got to move forward.
With any new research interest focus, the reason why I asked this question is I'm wondering through this pandemic, a lot of people talk about long COVID. Now,
Yeah.
one of those things is brain fog, which I
Yep.
experience on some days as well too. I don't know what that is, but I know I'm not the same. Now, I'm not trying to bring it to a point of like poor me, but I'm saying there's a point where like usually my ADHD keeps my thoughts at a high ramped up pace. Now, I took antidepressants, well not antidepressants, ADHD medication one time. My thoughts were not there. So what I'm experiencing with brain fog some days is that my thoughts aren't there. Like the ADHD, like I feel a little bit less than who I was if I was 100%. And I start to wonder, is that like when they say brain fog, I picture a cloud over my brain, but I just don't, there's a piece that's missing. There's a core element. I'm wondering if that's like something that you've recently been getting interested in.
So brain fog is a very common term, and it's used medically as well as colloquially, and nobody knows what it is, but it's a great word because everyone who hears it knows what it is,
I use it a
but
lot.
no expert knows what it means. Let's just say something's going on in there that's not normal, that your ability to think in a vivid and precise way is reduced.
Whenever I
So
forget to do something, I always go, "Oh, it's brain fog. Sorry, brain fog." Sorry.
yeah, I do not know what brain fog is, but it is there. It happens to people. There's all kinds of ways uh that it can happen. COVID including COVID. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the answer to that is nobody knows. Nobody knows what causes it, what it is.
Yeah, because I get to this point where what I can similarize it to is kind of like being on autopilot. Like, some people that they're conscious. They're walking around, they're doing that's them. They're doing their thing. It's Michael. Michael's chatting with me right now, but also autopilot. Like a lot of times when I don't do a script to the show and I just kind of free flow and talk and ask my own questions and we kind of have a conversation, some people don't really like that because it breaks them out of the normal interviews that they usually do. Like sometimes when I invite a guest on, I can tell when I'm hitting the same questions that they've been asked before because they have like it's like a script. They get it written down, they got it down in their head. But, I mean, everyday life, routines, for instance, people get on autopilot. You do the same thing over and over and over again. It's like you're walking around literally like a zombie. Like you might be conscious, awake, whatever you want to say, but you're not there. You're not paying attention to the we do it driving too. You're too aware of driving. You're not paying attention. You're trying to pay attention to traffic, but you're not hearing the wind in the trees. You're not paying attention to all the little side stuff that actually is important information if you really took hold of it.
Yeah. So I think the crucial word is attention, and you found just the right word for that. So there's this thing. Well, attention, of course, people use colloquially all the time, but it has this scientific meaning in the brain. Attention is a trick that, well, not a trick, a method, a data handling method that the brain uses that enhances some processing at the expense of other processing. And so attention is always what, as they say, a limited resource. You attend to one thing, it makes you push down your ability to process other things. And so attention, it's like an enhancer. You can focus your attention on this and really enhance it. You can distribute your attention a little bit, so you're a little bit enhancing these things. And so what happens is, as you get really good at something and you begin to automatize it, you need less and less attention on it. And the less attention you put on it, the less vivid it gets. It begins to kind of sink down. You're doing it, as you put it, in auto mode. That's, for example, people driving don't need that much attention, especially if you're driving very familiar streets. You're just not attending as much to what's going on around you. Um, or maybe you're, as you put it, in brain fog, or you're feeling sleepy one day and your overall level of attention is quite low. So there's just enough attention on this or that thing, um, but it's not enhancing the signals in your brain at a normal level. And so nothing seems as vivid, nothing seems as crisp, as normal. That's what attention does. It enhances signals in the brain, and it can go up and down. You have some control over it, but sometimes attention does its own thing, regardless of what you want.
Well, it's like prioritizing information. Like if we look at like levels of importance, even though I'm talking to you right now and I'm focusing on our conversation, I'm subconsciously aware that I'm on camera and I'm talking to something that people are going to be able to listen to. And that we can boil that down to an everyday activity where you're subconsciously thinking and remembering to breathe, your heart, all these other things. Now, whether you can function and do all that, you still have to know to take breaths when you talk and you have to know what words you're going to say next. They file in different categories, like different levels of importance.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's right. So, uh, even just looking at the world around you, you're automatically attending to one piece of the larger world. And that's mostly what you see. And everything else you're kind of assuming in some background way, you're assuming it's still there, but you're barely seeing it. Only if your attention moves to another piece of the world does that pop out at you. And so, yeah, most of the visual field in front of you is filled up with details that you barely process and barely know anything about. So attention is this very focused, enhancer, a spotlight, as some people like to call it. And that the brightness of that spotlight can go up and down. And so I imagine brain fog as being like the spotlight got dim for that day, and that must have something to do with it.
Um, and what you're currently working on, like what you're currently focused in. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, my lab right now is focused on this question of consciousness, meaning how do people have, and we study people, so other animals undoubtedly have this, but we study people. How do people have a subjective experience of anything at all? And the kinds of things we tend to study are vision, simple vision, like looking at pictures. When you look at an image on a computer screen, you're conscious of only some of it, and much of it goes in your eye and processed a little bit in your brain, but you're really not having an experience, any subjective experience of it, unless somebody points it out to you, and then suddenly you see it, and you're like, oh yeah, that's there. So we try to study what is it in the brain, what are the networks, what are the what's going on in there that makes the difference between merely processing such that you respond automatically without knowing it versus conscious experience. So that's one of the huge chunks of stuff that we do in the lab.
Yeah, because
Um,
I know when neuroscience, it kind of has to do with a lot of stuff about the brain, but I just didn't want to, everything we were saying for almost the past hour, I didn't want to feel like I was completely off the mark and I was just tossing out questions out of left field. But have you ever seen that video of a bunch of people walking with balloons? And they're like just walking around in a circle while music's playing, and then afterwards it cuts and says, "Did you see the gorilla?" And then it's a
yeah,
gorilla. Is that similar? Like,
yes,
yeah, because I'm not paying attention to that, but I feel like they added it in later. Everyone says that. How did I not see that? And it's like
yeah,
because they pointed it out to you, so it's like an area of focus, like making.
that's right.
Okay,
Yes, yes, the famous gorilla. It's running around in the video, and people don't even know it
yeah,
until you point it out to them, and then they're like, "What? No, you put that in there." So, yeah, that's exactly it. It's there's that little enhancer, the spotlight of attention has to be on something in order to make your brain conscious of it. Otherwise, you may process it to some degree, but you won't be conscious of it.
now
So
if I translate that over to like you ever seen a motivational book? They give you like the focus points of success, where they're like,
Ah,
do this and hustle, and you have to grind everything to get to your goals. Is that similar in some aspects? Like a lot of people feel like you have to be successful if you only prioritize this one thing. And I feel like the general public doesn't just prioritize sometimes one thing. It's more like a general consensus to keep life running the way it's been running. So,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm very suspicious of those kinds of success self-help
Me too.
books
Me too.
because I think the what they're really saying, the message they're really saying is the secret of success is buy my book and I'll be successful. I mean, that's what's really going on there. I don't think there's any actual actionable information in those books. Uh, but you know, the you can certainly change your life and your level of success by rethinking and reprioritizing. So I'm sure there's something in that. Like think carefully and come up with a good priority list. Know what to focus your attention on. That's obviously going to be good advice.
I feel like that's what those tip books are, though. Like how it relates in the way I thought of it was that when someone points something out to you, like sometimes outside eyes looking in on a problem that you can't, that you are dealing with, it
Mm,
kind of, it's your experience. Like I know my inner conflicts, I know my conflicts that I face, but when you get outside advice, someone looking in at a problem that you experience, they're now kind of tackling that experience with you in a sense, but they're also able to maybe see something more clear that you can't. Seems like a lot of times your vision becomes clouded in a sense.
yeah, sure. I mean, you put it right. I think it's like the gorilla in the picture. You don't see it, and then someone else points it out, and you're like, "Wow, how'd I miss that?"
I,
And that's true of everything. It's not just the video you're looking at. It's everything in your life. There's way too much info pouring into your brain every second for you to attend to and deeply process all of it. That's the whole point of attention, that it focuses on one thing at a time or a few things at a time so that you can get something done and get along in the world. But often other people with a different focus of attention see something you missed, and that can be really useful.
are there ways that you figured out that are able to kind of stimulate more of like that? I wouldn't say creativity. I would say more of like just your brain in general. Like music, for instance. I can't stop looking at the keyboard behind you, but
Ah, yes,
playing music in a sense is a way to help get your brain, people say, like stimulated or stimulating or getting ideas moving, but also it's a mood booster too. Like a lot of
that's true.
times it can capture that essence of what your emotion is and what you're experiencing at that time. For instance, like a hardcore rock song is good when you're angry.
Yeah, I mean, I love music. That's why I have my keyboard, um, and I find it helps me. And scientifically, I don't know what the answer to that is because I don't know what real research has been done on music. Um, I there's some kind of not very convincing research kind of at the edges or fringes of the field on music and how it influences intelligence and creativity and so on. And I'm not, I would not put a lot of stock in that science, but it's really hard science to do. And presumably, music, like any kind of stimulation, is good for your brain. So, yeah, that's, I can speak to you as as a human being who loves music. Yeah, it's great. It's very, very important to me. Um,
But but
excuse me,
but
but
just like you were talking about being able to recognize conscious, like if something's alive or dead, for instance, the example we talked about earlier, my music for the beginning of my podcast, that's AI created music. Now, I don't know if it's because I'm aware that I made the music through an AI generator, but going through that process of there's this site called Boomy where you can type in like whatever kind of like styles you want, and then it'll keep auto generating, creating music. It's good. It's like AI art. It's good, but it's slightly off. Like I can tell it's not made by a person. My brain can distinguish it. And I don't know. I couldn't give you examples of why it's off. I could just tell you it's just off. Like
yeah,
what is that? That doesn't make sense to my brain. I don't know what it is. There's just some images we can process and some we can't.
Yeah. Well, AI is amazing, but it's still kind of stupid compared to a
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
So yeah, music composition AIs are really interesting, but as sophisticated as they have become, they're still not, they're not real. They're not composing real music in the sense that really skilled people do.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I just wonder because everyone talks about like Skynet or Terminator or taking over the world.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we can create, not really, I would say, a brain or art. I mean, artificial intelligence to say it's like an AI brain, all that type of concepts that they do when it goes to like really weird kind of Terminator type discussions. But I don't think it's ever going to be able, like I said in the beginning, to replicate, or I don't know if it's going to ever surpass. I mean, there's definitely does things better than us, but the fear or the idea that something can keep intelligent, and is it evolution at a faster process then? Because I mean, we evolve through time. Our brains can either go in whichever direction depending on how much we let something do something for us. You end up losing a skill and picking up a new one, such as like technology involved into our lives or younger generations. You'll probably have kids that maybe aren't the alpha males that were smoking a cigarette and riding on biker jackets and doing that, but you'll have people that are able to have faster motor skills when it comes to their fingers or doing other types of capabilities of being able to program and building more digital stuff that can make their life easier in a sense.
I I think this is my opinion that AI will eventually have human level or more than human level intelligence,
Jesus.
and eventually will have the things that we call consciousness, because what we call our minds and our consciousness seems to depend on an interaction of neurons. I mean, billions of them. There's an estimated, I think it's 86 billion neurons in the human brain. It's a lot of neurons and incredibly rich, complicated interactions among them. And in principle, that is artificially buildable. Uh, I just think it's going to take a really long time, right? There's people who are futurists who say that in 10 years or 20 years, we're going to have this, we're going to have that. Uh, I do think it's probably going to happen, but it's going to be way longer than that.
Yeah.
Because the technology, there's so much that's not known. There's so much technology that has not been invented yet. Um, we know how to build a neuron, like a really good simulated neuron that's really close to an actual neuron. And we know how to put a few million of them together and train it to do simple tasks like self-driving cars or search the internet. Much of modern technology is now dependent on imitation neurons and little imitation artificial brains, basically. But the gap between where the technology is and what an actual human brain is so unbelievably gigantic that this is a much more distant future than many people think or many people fear.
Yeah, see, because if you're designing something like that and it does have these capabilities to be like ours and maybe better in a sense, would you think they would increase the memory storage on it? Like
Sure, yeah.
like our consciousness, obviously there's a Dunbar limit to the amount of things. Like I've done so many, I've done over 1,000 conversations. I can't remember every single person. I thought I could to a certain point, but then you start forgetting. And I wonder that memory part, like what our brain chooses to prioritize and what our brain chooses to get rid of. I mean, all memories I feel like are still stored in there. Like you can smell something, be like, oh my God, when I was 7 years old. And then you just go down this like weird thing that it just triggers something.
Yeah.
That's to me, that's I wonder what it prioritizes. Are those based on values of what that person values compared to?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. Uh, as it stands now, most computers have a memory that's designed to store at as much detail as possible everything that actually happened. Whereas the human brain and the brains of most animals, our memory is designed really differently. The whole purpose, in a sense, of a memory is not to store really specific information, but to extract general principles, right? Because the purpose of all of this is to help us survive in the world, in a complicated world. And so if you have 10 or 20 experiences and there's some commonalities between them, some common lessons, it's the common lessons, the common patterns that you really want to remember, right? So in a sense, the brain is designed as a machine that throws away details and tries to extract the deeper patterns and remember the commonalities across experiences. And this is one of the reasons why we don't have a really perfect computer-like memory, because it actually would not be good for us. It's just not what we're built for. So, there are people who have something anomalous in their brains that allows them to remember essentially every detail that ever happened to them. And that's not a good thing. Like, that doesn't help them become smarter or more capable in the world around them. So you could build computer systems with fantastic, amazing, extraordinary memory way beyond a human capacity. But evolution seems to have specifically built us not to have that and to give us a different skill set.
Now I got one more question. Like I said, this might be off the mark again, but
Okay, go for it.
when it comes with a dog, they say dog years. That's their experience. Is it faster? Is it shorter? Is it their lifespan? Is that just how we categorize them dying such at a young age compared to what human life capabilities are?
Yeah, I think so. I doubt that they have a fundamentally different experience. So time is really interesting. Nobody knows how time is represented in the brain. People know how space is represented in the brain, like why we know that this is over there and that is over here. Nobody knows how time is represented, how we know that this event happened yesterday and another event happened 3 years ago. So where the timeline is in the brain is a huge mystery, and how people perceive the movement of time is a huge mystery. It seems, though, my guess is that given the incredible similarity across all mammalian brains, that dogs and people and cats and rats and horses and so on probably have some experience of time that's very similar. I think dogs just live shorter. A person who is born and unfortunately passes away at the age of 10 probably in some sense has a very similar time experience as your typical dog.
Yeah, because I was a kid and someone told me that their years are like a day to them is like 48 hours or something like that. It's like seven, it's times seven or something like that. And I just thought like, so that mean when I'm walking, to me, I'm walking normal, but to them, I'm like extra, extra
Yeah,
slow.
no,
Okay.
definitely not.
All right.
Because they live in a world with the same physics that we
Yeah.
live in,
Yeah.
and they
Okay.
walk at the same rate that we walk at. So,
So we're just selfishly saying it's times seven just to justify them dying so early.
right, it's what we tell kids so the kids don't feel bad when the dog keels over.
It's like telling Santa Claus though, like you're messing with that person's reality. That's just a weird question because everyone's in their own realities. So if you look at someone else's perspective, technically they're not wrong. Now, is it with the general consensus or the general facts? But it's like that person that got you see a Scrubs episode where a lady got hit in the head and she just started hearing everybody sing like a Broadway musical. I'm like, if that's real, that's really scary. Like that's your whole reality is warped and affected. And I don't know because what's the brain going to be able to do? Is the brain going to let you know you're in a coma? No.
Nope.
It's going to keep it going until it finally wakes up.
Yep. Yeah, we are stuck. We are captive to the events in our own brains.
Prisoners of the Mind.
Yep.
That's a band from the 70s.
Ah, okay. Well, they had something right there.
Well, look, Michael, I appreciate you for doing my show, man. It was a pleasure. Is there a place where people can find you, Twitter, anything like that?
Well, I mean, you can look me up on the internet, Michael Graziano at Princeton. Stuff on. You'll find my webpage. You'll find this and that. There's a Wikipedia page, I believe, and so on.
Lucky, you got a Wikipedia.
I got a Wikipedia. Yes,
I'll
I
work
was
my way
happy.
there. I'll work my way there. I'll link
All
it
right.
all in the description. But thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.